Welcome. My name is Welcome. My name is Deborah Kaplan, and I'm moderating the webinar today. This webinar is part of a series that is showcasing best practices in Federal Section 508 implementation. Other presentations can be viewed at the link www.adaconferences.org/CIOC/archives and efedlink.org/resource-shared-webinars.cfm. Most of the archives are at the first link. A best practice is a policy, process, procedure, or technique proven effective over time and repeatable by multiple agencies or organizations. And a best practice is generalized so that diverse agencies may use it in their own organizations, but specific enough to provide useful guidance and instruction. The CIO Council's Accessibility Community of Practice has published a library of 508 best practices at www.section508.gov, and you'll find that many of those best practices are also the topics of several past webinars. Next slide. The upcoming webinars for the remainder of this year, 2017, we've already had webinars in January, March, and May. This is the July webinar, and we will have one more in September and one more in November. This year we're focusing on the 508 refresh regulations. The next webinar will be on September 26th, and the topic will be the software section of the revised 508 regulations, and it will be held from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the standard time for webinars in this series. This webinar series is a collaboration between the Accessibility Community of Practice of the CIO Council and the U.S. Access Board. Next slide, please. And you have the beautiful logos of the CIO Council and the Access Board on this slide. Next slide, please. So I'm now turning it over to Tim Cregan, and you'll hear the content of today's webinar.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for attending. Good afternoon, and welcome to this revised Section 508, Chapter 4 Hardware webinar, including mobile. Today's speakers, in addition to Debbie, the moderator, whom you already heard, will be me, Tim Cregan. I'm a Senior Accessibility Specialist here at the Access Board, as well as Bruce Bailey, who is an IT Accessibility Specialist. Next slide, please. Today's webinar, as Debbie indicated, is part of a series that happens to be the fourth in this year's series where we're focusing on the revised Section 508 standards. On this slide, we have the links to each of the webinars addressing the revised Section 508 standards. The best way to find this information is actually to go to the Access Board homepage, which is www.access-board.gov, and there's a link on our homepage which says ICT webinars, and it will eventually take you to these webinars. The three specific webinars are the ones from January. We gave an overview of the entire revised 508 rule. The second in the series was we talked about WCAG 2.0 and the revised standards. That was the one we gave on March 28th. And finally, the immediate webinar before this one in May, we talked about a comparison of the old and the new 508 standards, the original 508 standards and the revised standards. So these are webinars, these are links. You will find these very helpful. Next slide, please. Okay, we're now on slide 16 of today's agenda. Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 4 in the new rule. Chapter 4 is the longest rule. It is the longest chapter in the entire rule. It has the largest number of provisions, and they all deal with hardware. For purposes of today's discussion, we're going to focus our discussion on how those provisions apply to telecommunications products. So during the course of today's presentation, we're going to compare the revised Section 508 standards with the original 508 standards. We're going to talk about what's new, what's changed, and then we're going to focus on how the revised 508 standards apply to mobile. So today's presentation has a lot of content. Bruce and I are going to, always, you've heard us before, we're going to cover as quickly as we can the highlights for each provision. Please do not stress out if you feel that you can't possibly capture all the details. Remember, these webinars are archived. You have them to go back and review at your leisure. What we're doing today is trying to cover the high points of this particular chapter. So the last third of today's presentation is going to be an overview where we talk about the provisions from Chapter 4, and we're going to use them to analyze two types of telecommunications products. So with that, let's move on to our presentation. Okay, next slide. Slide 17. So the focus for today's webinar. Now I'm getting into the actual provisions themselves. Okay, as you've heard, because you've all doubtless listened to all of our webinars before, each chapter is numbered with the first number is always the number of the chapter. In this case, every provision starts with a 4. So today, the provisions we're going to focus most heavily on are provision 402, which is closed functionality, 407, operable parts, and 412, which is ICT with two-way voice. Why these three sections? Well, they're the longest and the most detailed sections in hardware, and they include several exceptions. They have the greatest applicability to mobile technology, but remember, mobile technology is also affected by software. We are not talking about software today, but only the hardware provisions. And then finally, the other provisions in the hardware chapter are much shorter than 402, 407, and 412, and they happen to be a little more straightforward. So let's move on.
My name is Bruce Bailey. We're on slide 18. I'm going to give you an overview of the major changes, remind you of what we talked about a couple webinars ago, that the revised standards are organized by functions and not product types is the biggest thing. The revised standards make reference to external industry consensus standards as needed, and you'll see some of that today, although not as extensively as when we talked about the comparison to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG citations. As you saw on the previous page, the previous slide, the sections are not formatted using the Federal Register style. So we're using each chapter is a single digit, and then a 3-digit whole number of the section, and then decimals for subsections, and there can even be subsections within a subsection. So you might have 2 decimal points, or even the more complicated portions, 3 decimal points. We're not going to be stepping through all of the provisions in Chapter 4. We will be giving you several examples of that, and again, we're focusing on the ones that are the most complicated. Each major section will start with a general charging statement. There can be exceptions to a section, or exceptions to a subsection, and the subsections themselves can have subsections and exceptions within the subsection. So it does get a little complicated. And then finally, the last point I want to make is that the requirements for real-time text are reserved, and we're pending on future rulemaking with the FCC. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in a moment. And then the last thing that I forgot to mention is that for today's presentation, when you hear my voice, I'm going to be mostly talking about things that are new in the revised standards that are not new as compared to what we had with the original 508 requirements. And with that, I'll take you to slide 19.
Thank you, Bruce. To continue with Bruce's comparison, when you hear my voice, I will be talking about the original 508 standards and what is similar. Whereas Bruce will be taking you into the future, I'll be talking to you in the present. So on this slide, slide 19, we're doing a high-level comparison between Chapter 4 and revised 508 standards, which is in the column on the right-hand side of the page. On the left-hand column on the page, we have provisions listed from the original 508 standards. The purpose of this is to illustrate the origin of many of the provisions in Chapter 4. One of the things we want to emphasize for today's audience is if you are familiar with the original 508 standards, you will be happy to find that many of your old friends, so to speak, are present in this chapter. Many of the provisions that were scattered among 6 different areas in the original standards and gathered together here because they constitute hardware functions of ICT. So first of all, let's start off in revised 508. In Chapter 2, we have our scoping requirements. And the specific scoping requirement is E, E being the prefix for everything involving Section 508, E206 hardware, and then there's a parent scoping provision E206.1 general. That is analogous to, in the original 508, 1194.2, which was where you find your application statements. Going back to the technical requirements in Chapter 4, hardware, which is what we're talking about today, we have 401, which is a general statement, and then we have 401.1, which is a scoping statement, which includes an exception for assistive technology. The rest of the provisions in the chapter, as you will see, will derive from the original 508 standards from 1194.23, telecommunications products, the hardware features of 1194.24, video and multimedia products, 1194.25, self-contained closed products, and finally 1194.26, desktop and portable computers. All right, let's see where this goes. Next slide. So we're on slide 20. We're talking about the scoping of hardware from chapters 2 and 4. And again, the scoping provision E206.1 general, where components of ICT are hardware and transmit information or have a user interface, such components shall conform to the requirements in Chapter 4. You'll remember in the previous webinars in the series, the revised 508 standards go from front to back. So you always start off with the beginning chapters of the rule, and you read forward through each subsequent chapter. So you start off with your definitions and scoping chapters, and then they send you, in this case, to Chapter 4. Then you read your first scoping statement for Chapter 4, 401.1, scope. The requirements of Chapter 4 shall apply to ICT that is hardware, when required by 508 Chapter 2 scoping, which we've just seen, and were otherwise referenced in any other chapter of these standards. And remember, the one exception is that hardware that is assistive technology is not covered by these requirements. Next slide, please. Okay. So the overview for closed functionality has 5 sub-provisions. 402.1 general, 402.2, which is speech output enabled, 402.3 volume, 402.4 characters on display screens, and 402.5 characters on variable message silence. And we are going to go into detail now. Okay, for Chapter 22, general requirement for 402 closed functionality is very familiar. When we look at the language of the revised 402.1 general, you'll see that it talks about ICT with closed functionality shall be operable without requiring the user to attach or install assistive technology other than personal handsets or other audio couplers, and shall conform to 402, which is the provisions, all of the provisions for 402. Now, it's interesting because in the original 508, we had the concept of technology was closed. You couldn't attach anything to it except a headset, and a headset was not considered assistive technology. So we see how these requirements have been incorporated into the new provision. Let's continue. Next slide, please. Slide 23. The definition for closed functionality is very similar. In the revised 508 standards, we go to our Chapter 1, where we find our definitions. E103.4, defined terms. Closed functionality. And it talks about ICT's characteristics that limit the functionality or prevent a user from attaching or installing assistive technology. Again, this is very similar to the definition which is found in the original 508 of 1194.4, self-contained closed products. The examples in the revised standard include examples of closed functionality such as self-service machines, information kiosks, set-top boxes, fax machines, calculators, and computers that are locked down so that the functionality may not be accessed. And this can be due to a policy such as desktop core configuration. The reason we put this in is to reflect modern ICT practices, because something may have closed functionality for reasons beyond the design. It may be because of a policy. Next slide, please.
So we're on slide 24, And this is a new requirement for closed products with closed functionality really, to be speech output enabled. The old requirement from 1194.25a in the original 508 was just that self-contained products shall be usable by people with disabilities. A little bit vague there. Now we're having the affirmative requirement that ICT with a display screen shall be speech output enabled for full and independent use by individuals with visual impairments. That's 402.2. So in addition to the emphasis on functionality as opposed to products, we are now the big change is affirmatively requiring that these things that are closed have speech built into them. That's the only, in all these years, that's the way that we found things to be accessible. Next slide, 25. This requirement for speech out enabled mirrors the requirements that we have with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, for ATMs and for vending machines. So the requirements are, there's a lot of experience with making these kind of self-contained, self-service machines accessible, but it's new to have this kind of detail in 508. It's not new for these to be federal regulations. We have them in ADA. We have them under the Architectural Barriers Act as well in the federal government. It's a complicated section. There's 6 exceptions and 5 subsections, and I'll be walking through some of these. So next slide, slide 26. I want to talk about the exceptions that are in there. Since we're requiring speech output by default, it makes sense that we would want to have some pretty broad exceptions so that we're not requiring things that, it's really technically infeasible or impossible for these things to have the speech built in. We want our requirements to reflect that while still maintaining the accessibility. So the first one is about variable message signs. I'm going to be talking about what I mean by a variable message sign in a minute because we do have some specific requirements on those. But these are, a display-only ICT product, a monitor typically, where there's no interactivity and they are not required to have speech. So these things are very common. They've become more common in the last many years. But we're talking about the things you find at airports and train stations where they're doing all the arrivals and departures. All those things are variable message signs. It would also include things you find them in sometimes in office buildings where they'll have messages a day and what things are going, what events are going on, or where rooms are located. So variable message signs that conform to 402.5 should not be required to be speech output enabled. 402.5, which I'll get to in just a minute, is the requirements specifically for variable message signs. Speech output output shall not be required when the ICT display screens only provide status indicators or those indicators conform to 409. So we don't reference screen size, and there's many, many small devices that have display screens. We cover, the 508 requirements cover all that, all those different things. But if it's just providing a status indicator and those indicators conform to 409, which I'll go to in a little bit more detail, then it's acceptable for the ICT not to be speech output enabled itself. The third exception out of the 6 is where speech output cannot be supported due to constraints in available memory or processor capability. ICT should be permitted to conform to our requirements for status indicators 409 in lieu of 402.2. So we do make consideration and have this exception for things that have very, very little processor capability. Next slide, slide 27. The final 3 exceptions under 402.2, that audible tone shall be permitted instead of speech output where the content of the user input is not displayed as entered for security purposes. Again, this language comes directly from ADA, where if you're entering a personal identification number, you might hear beeps or asterisks or see asterisks, and you don't want the speech output giving that away. A very similar idea is the 5th exception about speech outputs not required for machine location, date, time, customer account number, and machine identifiers. Again, those exceptions are all in the requirements for ATMs and for vending machines to be speech output enabled. Very often, most people don't even notice that these things are on the screen. They're not central to the location. They're usually in small print. Sometimes they're only on a receipt. So these are all things that are common but incidental to the actual transaction. So those are not required to be spoken or vocalized by the speech output on the system. And then finally, speech output is not required for advertisements or other similar information unless those advertisements convey information that can be used in the actual transaction. So if, say, we're covering something like the red box, and it gives you, if you interact with the commercial, that you get a discount on your purchase, well, that needs to be accessible. But if it's just in the advertisement, we're not requiring that those advertisements be accessible per se. Next slide, slide 28. I want to go over of the subsections, the detail within 402.2. And there's 5 of those: information displayed on screen, transactional outputs, speech delivery type and coordination, user control, and Braille instructions. Next slide, slide 29. 402.2.1, information displayed on screen, very basic. Speech output shall be provided for all information displayed on screen. Transactional outputs, again, this is new to 508, but again tracks very closely to the requirements on ATMs and fair vending machines, that where transactional outputs are provided, the speech output shall audibly provide all information necessary to verify a transaction. That's in there because you don't want something coming out in print or on receipt or on your transactional output, your ticket maybe, that has information that you haven't heard. So very important. Next slide, slide 30. Speech delivery type and coordination, 402.2.3. Speech output shall be delivered through a mechanism that is readily available to all users, including, but not limited to, an industry standard connector or a telephone handset. Speech output shall be recorded or digitized, human or synthesized. That came up because in the early days of ATMs and talking fair machines, some manufacturers couldn't do speech synthesis, but they could do recorded speech, so that's perfectly acceptable. And then finally, the speech output shall be coordinated with the information displayed on the screen, because some people listening are trying to follow what they can see of the display screen, and some people can see fine, but they like hearing the audio. So very important again. And next slide, slide 31. User control. The speech output for any single function shall be automatically interrupted when a transaction is selected, and the speech output should be capable of being repeated and paused. It's very important that the speech be interactive, of course. Next slide, 32, Braille instruction. Where speech output is required by 402.2, Braille instructions for initiating the speech mode shall be provided. And then there's a citation to the ADA accessibility guidelines, which specifies the characteristics of Braille. Nothing surprising there at all. It's just details the specific measurements of Braille cells. Then there is this important exception about devices for personal use shall not be required to conform to 402.2.5. So if the device is something that's assigned to a specific individual, say your desk phone or your smartphone, or a calculator, that there does not need to be, that thing is ICT. It's covered by 508, but it's probably required to have the speech output enabled, but it's not required to have the Braille instruction per se. It makes sense. These things are typically small. It's hard to put the Braille on the things that wouldn't physically fit. But also, if it's your own personal device, you have lots of time ahead of time to figure out how the speech works, so you don't need Braille instructions for initiating the speech mode. The other thing I will say about this is that this personal use exception appears in a couple other places. It's a pretty important concept. It doesn't mean that an individual procured it. It means that it's assigned to a specific individual. So 508 applies to everything. All that ICT that's covered by 508 is the federal government's procuring it, but it may be assigned to specific individuals. So that's the personal use exception. Next slide, slide 33. Volume control, ICT that delivers sound, including speech and output required by 402.2, shall provide volume control and speech amplification conforming to 402.3. And then there's an exception about that's actually for two-way voice communication, which is the reference to 412.2, and it breaks it into private listening and non-private listening. And those specific requirements there are going to be pretty familiar. So we'll hear from Tim on slide 34.
Yes, so here we are. We're listening to the requirements for private listening. Now remember, we are not talking about our conventional telephone. This is not a situation where you have two-way voice. This is a situation where there is voice output only in one direction. So this is the requirement for private listening. In the new provision, 402.3.1, Where ICT provides private listening, it shall provide a mode of operation for controlling the volume. And then secondly, it says where ICT delivers output by an audio transducer, typically held up to the ear, a means for effective magnetic wireless coupling to hearing technologies shall be provided. Both of these provisions are very familiar, and they were discussed in 1194-25, subsection E for telecommunications products. Let's take a look at more of the private listening requirements. Next slide, please. Slide 36, we're talking about 402.3.1, the changes to requirements for private listening. Now, instead of saying that you have to have audio of a standard signal level, what we're saying is, no, you have to control the volume. This is a requirement to control the volume. Secondly, your requirement for effective magnetic coupling can be met in a number of ways. It can be met for a headphone jack so that someone can plug in a personal headset to listen to the sound output. You can have a hardwired telephone-style handset, or you can have Bluetooth. So these are examples that meet with the modern requirement for listening. Okay, let's continue. Next slide. Now, non-private listening is familiar. Non-private listening is where the sound is going, it's not just going to one individual person, but it be going to a whole group of people at one spot. So this is 402.3.2. It says where ICT provides non-private listening, incremental volume control shall be provided with output amplification up to a level of at least 65 decibels. And then it says a function shall be provided to automatically reset the volume to the default level after every use. Both of these requirements, the 65 decibel gain and the automatic reset for volume, are very familiar, and they're found in 1194-25F in the original 508 provisions. But let's see what's different. Next slide, please. 402.3.2 does not include requirements for volume gain over ambient noise. The original provision as drafted in 508 talked about having a 20 decibel volume gain over ambient noise. We removed that requirement because commenters from industry made it clear that this was a problematic requirement or was infeasible. Part of the requirement is because you have no idea when you build this what the ambient noise level is going to be in a given situation. And it's very dependent on installation and configuration. So it's not reasonable for manufacturers to be put in the situation of trying to guess what might be the baseline above which they're trying to operate. So again, the requirement is just reduced to saying that 65 decibel gain. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Bruce for more new requirements.
So on slide 38, about 402.4, characters on display screen, which is new, and again comes from the similar requirement under ADA and ABA for ATMs and fair vending machines, that at least one mode of characters displayed on the screen shall be in a sans serif font, and that where ICT does not provide a screen enlargement feature, the characters shall be at least 3/16 of an inch high based on the uppercase letter I. And then finally, there's a contrast requirement that characters must contrast with their background, with either light characters on a dark background or dark characters on a light background. We had several comments that they'd like something more specific for that, but so much of, when you're talking about hardware, so much depends on installation that we couldn't have a more objective metric measurement than contrast light on dark or dark on light. Next slide, slide 39, where I mentioned the characters on variable message signs, that characters on message signs are required to conform to section 703.7 of ICC A1771, which is accessible and usable buildings facilities, again published by a trade organization. That reference is available online, as well as for commercial purchase at a pretty reasonable price. So the definition of what a variable message sign is basically that it's and it's in our definitions, E103.4, We're talking about non-interactive electronic signs with scrolling, streaming, or page-down capability. An example of a variable message sign is an electric message board at a transit station that displays the gate and time information associated with the next train arrival. So we've deferred to this industry consensus document, this industry consensus standard about what it means for a variable message sign to be accessible. But again, they're not required to be speech output enabled.
Thank you, Bruce. Now we're on slide 40. We're talking about provision 403, biometrics. This, again, is one of those provisions that looks very familiar because it has similar information in original 508. So 403.1 general provides that where provided, biometrics shall not be the only means for user identification or control. The exception says that where at least two biometric options that use different biological characteristics are provided, ICTs shall be permitted to use biometrics as the only means for user identification or control. So, for example, that means if the system required that an individual have either fingerprints or retina scans, that would be examples of two different biometric requirements. So that is a case where they could potentially allow biometrics as the only means of user identification and control. Another example would be a voice recognition system paired with fingerprints. As long as there's a variety of biometric systems, that's the only time that you can require biometrics as the sole means of identification. And again, this is very similar from original 508 in 25 and 26B. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is slide 41, 404, preservation of information provided for accessibility. Again, this is one of those provisions that's very familiar. 404.1 general says, ICT that transmits or converts information or communication shall not remove non-proprietary information provided for accessibility, or shall restore it upon delivery. So think about captioning. You should not remove the captioning from content. In other words, those features that allow the materials to be made accessible should be restored if you transmit or convert the information. And again, this is from 1194.23J, where it talks about technology. Again, very similar principle carried over into the new rule. Thank you. Bruce?
Next slide, 42, on privacy. This is new. The same degree of privacy of input and output shall be provided to all individuals. When the screen output required by 402.2 is enabled, the screen shall not blank automatically. Again, using phrasing that comes from ADA 7074, but new to 508.
Okay. Now on slide 43, we're looking at provision 406, standard connections. Again, this is another very familiar provision. It reads, where data connections used for input and output are provided, at least one of each type of connection shall conform to industry standard non-proprietary formats. This is very similar to 1194.26D, where we talked about slots, ports, and connectors. Again, the concept was familiar, and we've carried it over into the new standards. Next slide, please. 407, operable parts. This is another one of the very large sections. It has 8 subsections. Bruce is going to be covering most of it. What I'll do is just tell you that, first of all, 407.1 general, it talks about, it says that where provided, operable parts, and this is an important qualifier, operable parts used in the normal operation of ICT shall conform to 407. The reason we put that language in, operable parts used in the normal operation of ICT, is because there is always a debate if someone said, well, the particular function that you're talking about is actually maintenance, and no one actually does it except when they're maintaining the ICT. So to make it clear that we wanted the functional components of the ICT used in the normal operation to be accessible, we put that in the general scoping provision for operable parts. The rest of the provisions, 407.2 contrast, 407.3 input controls, 407.4 key repeat, 407.5 timed response, 407.6 operation, 407.7 tickets, fare cards, and key cards, on 407.8, reach, height, and depth, Bruce will now address. Bruce?
So next slide 45, the very first item listed there, 407.2 contrast, is new, and this is similar phrasing, that where provided, keys and controls shall contrast visually from background surfaces. Okay, that's new to 508. And then this other language I just spoke of, the characters and symbols shall contrast visually from background surfaces, either light characters or symbols on a dark background, or dark characters or symbols on a light background. Next slide, 46, input controls. This is a pretty big change in that we have this devices for personal use with input controls that are audibly discernible without activation and operable by touch shall not be required to 407. So that means for the first time, 508 is permitting certain touch screens touch screens that are speech output enabled, or on devices that are speech output enabled. We are requiring touch screens as the only means of input for some devices.
Okay, now for the next slide.
Well, the 407.3, though, tactily discernible, the general principle is not new. Input controls shall be operable by touch and tactily discernible without activation. The big thing is having this exception for devices for personal use, but they'll have to follow that.
So our next slide, we're on slide 48. Again, this is one of those requirements that's very familiar. As Bruce just said, the requirement for tactily discernible, 407.3.1, it notes that input control shall be operable by touch and tactily discernible without activation. That's directly reminiscent of 1194.23K sub 1. So as we've been saying all along, a lot of the provisions in Chapter 4 hardware are very familiar. It's just a question of renumbering and better organization in their functional capabilities. Now, Bruce,
let me interject here that this 23K, it ends up being cross-referenced in the original 508 by 25C and 26A. So, that point ends up getting used quite a bit. And with that, I'll take us on to our next slide, 48, the alphabetical keys. That this is new, that we're provided individual alphabetical keys shall be arranged in a QWERTY-based layout, and the F and J keys shall be tactically distinct from the other keys. And then next slide, 49, we have another new requirement for numeric keys, 407.3.3, where provided numeric keys shall be arranged in a 12-key ascending or descending keypad layout, and that the number 5 key shall be tactically distinct from the other keys. And then also new is this business about if you're using an alphabet on letters mapped to the number keys, we specify that you follow ITUT, which recommendation E161, which describes that mapping. It's what most of us are familiar with on our telephone keypads, but since the Q and Z keys are sometimes varies from phone to phone, we've picked this one standard that industry has settled on as well.
Okay, now we're on slide 50. Slide 54, 7.4, key repeat. This is another one of those very familiar provisions. Again, this is from that 1194.23K series. This is from K3. It says where a keyboard with key repeat is provided, the delay before the key repeat feature is activated shall be fixed at or adjustable to 2 seconds minimum. So that means that as needed, the delay in operating keys can be adjusted from 2 seconds to longer as needed. Okay, let's move on. Here's the provision 407.8, reach, height, and depth. All right, what this applies to, this provision applies to stationary ICT. Most commonly, we're talking about stationary ICT, we're thinking of the large copier machines, those ones which technically they're movable, but the reality is they're so large, you place them in a copy room and they sit there. So they shall be at a height conforming to the height provisions 407.8.2 or 407.8.3, according to the position established by a vertical reference plane specified in 407.8.1 for side or forward reach. The operable parts used with speech output require to be by 402.2 shall not be the only type of operable part complying with this reach height and depth provision unless that part is the only operable part of its type. Okay, so what this means is if you have a freestanding copy machine, we're now allowing for both forward and side approach. Let's look at the next slide, please. Slide 52, overview of 407.8 reach height and depth. And the sub-provisions are 407.8.1, vertical reference plane, 407.8.2, side reach, 407.8.3, forward reach, new. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I want you all to think back to the requirements for side reach in the original 508 provisions where there were the diagrams about coming up alongside of a freestanding copy machine. This 407.8 reach height and depth is covering the same functional requirements. The one addition is instead of only side reach from a wheelchair user, you're also considering forward reach, which has other requirements which we won't go into today because stationary ICT does not apply to two-way voice communication. For purposes of today's discussion, we're just giving you a very, very brief overview. The concept of vertical reference plane is, again, from original 508 provisions. When you look at or orient yourself before the ICT, you conceptualize that all of your controls and keys are located on sort of an imaginary physical plane in front of you, and they're oriented accordingly. So this is all we're going to talk about for today's provision. Next slide, please. We're on slide 53. As I said, it's very familiar. It's very similar to 1194.25J, which terminology was talked about, freestanding non-portable products intended to be used in one location. Here it's described as stationary ICT. There's more information on that. And for today's provision, as I said, we're just giving a very, very broad overview. Next slide, 54. Again, the changes to reach height and depth. Again, on 407.8, we're using the term stationary ICT as a scoping description. We're allowing for a forward approach. We do not have illustrations in the official text of this version. Illustrations, unless they're specifically described as being part of the text, are always advisory. And in this case, we will eventually be posting technical assistance online, which will include diagrams and scoping. We have not done that yet. But we will be providing more detailed technical assistance on this section. The measurements that are in the text are controlling, and they're written out in great detail.
One thing I will mention here is that we have changed the height requirement from 54 in the original 2000 standards down to 48 inches as your maximum height with the revised standards, and that's, again, to conform to the feedback that went into the ADA standards.
And as Bruce is saying, again, as we go along, the intent is to make the various technical requirements conformant to changes in technology, but also to reflect more accuracy and similar approaches. With that, I'll turn this over to Bruce for a description of 408 display screens.
So we're on slide 55. The first part of this is new in that where stationary ICT provides one or more display screens, at least one of each type of display screen shall be visible from a point 40 inches above the floor space where the display screen is viewed. And again, that is consistent with the ADA requirements about viewing height. Next slide, slide 56.
Okay. This is Tim. I'm back because 408 display screens has provisions that are very familiar. It has a subsection provision that talks about flashing, 408.3 flashing. This says when ICT emits light in flashes, there shall be no more than 3 flashes in any 1 second period. This is very, very similar to the original provisions in 1194.25I, which talked about frequency flicker rates greater than between 2 hertz and lower than 55 hertz. In the revised provision, we talked about no more than 3 flashes in any 1 second. We think that's a more user-friendly measurement. And also, the exception is that flashes that do not exceed the general flash and red flash threshold defined in WCAG 2.0 are not required to conform to 408.3. So, next slide, please. 408.3. Okay. So now we're talking about status indicators. Again, this is familiar content. 409.2, where provided, status indicators shall be discernible visually and by touch and sound. This is very similar to 1194.23K, subpart 4, locking and stylus control keys, visually discernible and through touch or sound. Next slide. 410, color coding. Again, 410.1 general. Color coding shall not be used as the only means of conveying information, indicating action, prompting response, or distinguishing a visual element, just like 1194.25G. Keep going. Overview of 412, ICT with two-way voice communication. All right, this is, again, another one of those very long provisions. This has 7 subsections. First one is general. 402.2 talks about volume gain. Remember, this is in a two-way voice situation, so this is different from our previous requirement for just volume, which was one way only. 403, interference reduction and magnetic coupling. 412.4, digital encoding of speech. 412.5, real-time text functionality. 412.6, caller ID. 412.7, video communication. All right, we're going to go through these fairly quickly. Next slide, please. We're on slide 60. So it's 412.1, general. It says ICT that provides two-way voice communication shall conform to 412. And then there's 2 provisions underneath this for volume gain. For two-way voice communication, what you're looking at is volume gain for wireline telephones. So think of a hardwired telephone into the wall. And then the accompanying provision for 12.2.2 is volume gain for non-wireline ICT. In other words, something that doesn't have any wires. Next slide, please. 61, volume gain for wireline phones is very familiar. It's 412.2.1, and it conforms to 47 CFR 68317, provided on analog and digital wireline telephones. So basically, it's talking about gains adjustable up to 20 decibels, and in the current standard, we're talking about 18 decibels instead of 20. So 18 decibels, which is actually conformant with what the FCC requires in their requirements. Okay, next slide, please. 62, the distinction between wireline and wireless. What we're doing here is we're saying that there are different standards that apply. So when you're talking about wireline telephones, the volume gain shall conform to 47 CFR 68.317, which, as we just mentioned in the slide before, it was a requirement for volume gain, and it is incorporated in the Federal Communications Regulations. For volume gain for non-wireline ICT, which is 412.2.2, it just says there should be a method for increasing volume should be provided for non-wireline ICT. At the present time, there is actually no agreed upon standard for non-wireline ICT. So moving forward, next slide. 412.3, interference reduction and magnetic coupling. So it says a handset or audio that is held up to the ear, ICT shall reduce interference with hearing technologies and provide a means for effective magnetic coupling, wireless coupling in conformance with the 2 provisions for wireless and wireline handsets. Next slide. 412.3, magnetic coupling, very familiar. It says shall reduce interference with hearing technologies. And this, again, is very similar to the language found in 1194.23H and I. Keep going. We're now at 412.3.1 and 412.3.2. These are the new provisions, and the importance of this is these specify the technical requirements. ICT and wireless handsets conforms to ANSI 6319, and that for wireline handsets conforms to TIA 1083B.
So the only thing that's new here is the external references to these external standards. Similarly, next slide, 412.4. This is wholly new about how speech is compressed on on an IP-based network, Internet Protocol-based network. There's a citation out to G722.2. And next slide, slide 67, real-time text functionality 412.5. This is a section that's reserved. It's going to be important, but right now there was the recent rulemaking by the FCC, report and order on December 16, 2016, a petition to upgrade, to update the Commission's rules for access to support transmission from TTY to real-time text technology, and there's a petition for waivers of the rules to require the support of legacy TTY technology. So all of this is, all in flux, and the FCC is very much embracing and supporting these mainstream carriers that want to move to more modern real-time text systems, IP-based systems. So they're being very flexible and allowing the carriers to experiment with some of these things. So we expect to have real-time text requirement on IP networks at some future date, but at this point it's reserved. The requirement for caller ID, slide 68.
Very familiar. This is 412.6. And it says, where provided, caller identification and similar telecommunications functions shall be visible and audible. This was found in 1194.23e. Okay, next slide.
Slide 69, 412.7, video communication. This is new, that where ICT provides real-time video functionality, the quality of the video shall be sufficient to support communication using sign language. So a bit of a performance requirement, and again, a new requirement in 508. Tim, I'm going to suggest we kind of really blow through these next few because we want to get to our comparison port. So I'm going to just try and very briefly go over these. These are these are similar to what we have with the current hardware requirements. 413, that closed caption processing be included.
Oh, that's right, Bruce. 413 general, it's very similar to the closed captioning processing provisions found in 1194.24a. Next slide, please. Slide 71, revised 413. There's some minor differences. We don't refer to small screens. We don't distinguish between old technology like analog TVs anymore. We focus on the functionality, which is the whole important thing, closed captioning processing. Next slide. Slide 72, 414, audio description processing is very familiar. It's 414.1 general. And it has sub-provisions for digital television tuners and other ICT, which is references to where it's applied in different technical situations. But again, this is derived from 1194.24b in original 508. So you've seen this before. It's just reorganized. Next slide.
Slide 73 is our changes. We've moved the references to secondary audio program. We're using more digital, the digital references and digital TVs. And then 415 about user controls and audio description, that we require the controls to be readily available and nearby, or enabled through system-wide platform settings. We're going to see that in a moment when we talk about smartphones, system-wide platform settings for user controls for captioning and audio.
Okay, this is Deborah Kaplan again. We're shifting the presentation now, and we're going to go rather quickly through two examples of how you apply these standards to two different types of technology. And so we're going to show you what the process would be in order to arrive at decisions about which standards apply and where one ought to focus any kind of evaluation of the accessibility of real technologies to the new standards. Next slide, please, 76. So we're going to be looking at modern IP desktop phones for one scenario, and then we're going to look at how you would evaluate a modern mobile phone or smartphone. And so I'm turning this over to Bruce.
So I'm going to be doing a very quick, way too fast overview of what I would look through for Chapter 4 for the most salient issues with evaluating an IP desk phone against the revised Chapter 4. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about an IP desk phone? What do these things all have in common? Well, we're talking about something that has lots of buttons, something you find in an office environment. So in addition to the 12 numeric keypads, there's buttons for maybe doing voicemail and conferencing, dedicated lines for headsets and handsets, and for increasing the volume. In particular, on this phone that I've got on the picture here, which is a Cisco phone, is a pretty popular model, it's got a large screen. These phones typically do have a pretty prominent display. It's not a real fancy display in that it's not in color. It doesn't support video, but the display is pretty important and pretty significant. And in particular, there's 4 buttons at the bottom of the display that change their function depending on what the phone is doing. So that's a little bit tricky for somebody who can't see the display. So we'll be talking about that. So we've got a large display, no color, no video. It's not a touchscreen, and it's using these internet protocol. It's linked to a desktop PC. The usual configuration is that the desktop PC plugs into the phone, and then the phone plugs into the wall, your network connection on the wall. And I just want to say that I'm going to be going through these next pieces very, very fast, making references back to the provisions we just went over in a little bit more detail. First, I'm going to do a very, very quick kind of triage, trying to figure out which section, see if I can rule out some sections from Chapter 4. Then I'm going to take a look at the easy things, and then I'm going to take a look at the things that are a little bit more difficult to address. So with that in mind, what's the first pass that I might do for an IP desk phone through Chapter 4? And I can rule out some things as not going to be so important, and I can recognize that some things are going to be very important to give a lot of attention to. So 401 general, nothing really in there. 402 closed functionality, I've got it bolded and underlined here because that is definitely going to be important. 403 biometrics, I can cross that one out, and I have on the screenshot because there's no biometrics involved. Preservation for information provided for accessibility, maybe, I don't know. That's a little more complicated, so I'll leave that one alone. 405 privacy, 406 standard connections, both of those might matter. 407 operable parts, again bolded, that's going to be in particular to get a lot of attention. 408 display screens, maybe. 409 status indicators, maybe. 410 color coding, maybe. 411 audible signals, maybe. Then again, another underline emphasize. 412 ICT with two-way voice communication, that's going to be important. Pay a lot of attention there. And then the next 3 I can pretty much dismiss. 413, closed caption processing technology, audio description processing technology, and 415, user controls audio technology. Don't need any of those. All right, so I said that was my first triage pass. Now I'm going to do try and figure out what are the easy things. Preservation of information provided for accessibility. I think that was back on slide 41. It's just not applicable, so cross that one off. 405, privacy. Again, if we go back to what we had on the slide a few minutes ago, easily conforms. So same thing with 406, standard connectors. It's RJ45, no problem there. 408 display screens was just about flashing, and it only is applicable, it's not applicable to stationary ICT display height, so that one conforms, don't need to worry about it. 409, status indicators. Oh dear, yes, this one definitely needs attention. So this time I've got it bolded, underlined, and in italics. Got to come back to that. 410, color coding. These things are monochrome. They don't use color to indicate information, so that's not applicable. 412, audible signals, that there be a visual display for when the phone rings. Most of these IP desk phones would do that, so probably not a problem, and it conforms. So it's applicable, but not going to be an issue. Next slide, slide 80. Let's take a look at the speech output enabled, which seems like that would be the toughest requirement for something like a desktop phone. So ICT with a display screen shall be speech output enabled for full and independent use by individuals with visual impairments. Well, it's certainly ICT with a display screen. But then you may remember back, we had this exception about where speech output cannot be supported due to constraints in available memory or processor capability, but the ICT can just be permitted to conform to 409 in lieu of 402.2. So this exception comes into play. This desk phone is not required to be speech output enabled. Next slide, slide 81. Again, I'm going to drill down for a little bit more into 407 and their operable parts. Look at the pieces of operable parts. 407 contrast, it meets that, no problem. Black on white or dark on light or light on dark, it does that for sure. 407.3 input controls, that one might need a little bit more attention, especially the 407.3.1 tactically discernible. Certainly that needs attention. We'll have to, and I'll drill down to that in a minute. 407.3.2 alphabetical keys doesn't have it, so it's not applicable, no problem. 407.3.3 numeric keys, absolutely it's applicable, but every one I've ever seen conforms to that, so that's not a problem. Got that one checked off. 407.3 key repeat, ooh, that might be an issue. 407.5 timed response, certainly that might come into play, so that one needs attention. 407.6 operation, if I look through the details there, that's about, how many pounds of force and operable with one hand, no problem, it conforms. 407.7 tickets and fare cards, that's not applicable to a desk phone. And then 407.8 about reach height and depth, that's not applicable to something that's not stationary. So we've only hit a couple of these things that are going to be important to look at in a little bit more detail. Next slide, 82. Volume gain. Those were all pretty detailed. 412.2.1. Fortunately, most models are going to conform with that, so there shouldn't be a problem. Do need to check, though. 412.3, interference reduction and magnetic coupling for wireline handsets. 412.32. Again, shouldn't be a problem with certain models commercially available, so the conformance there is not difficult. 412.4 and digital encoding of speech, that was the G722.2. Again, most models, or there certainly will be models that can do that. So that one's good to check off, but not hard. Then we get into the two that are a little bit more difficult. 412.2, 412.5, real-time text functionality. Remember that was reserved. It's going to be an issue in the future, though. 412.6 caller ID, that the caller ID be available for people that can't see the screen. That seems like that's tricky. I don't know that most phones do that out of the box. 412 video communication, not applicable. It's not a video phone. So we've come up with a couple here that are going to be important to come back to. So let's summarize those up. Slide 83. Evaluating an IP desk phone against the 508 Chapter 4 hardware requirements. 407.2 contrast, check, but probably not an issue. 407.3.1 tactically discernible. That needs careful attention. I'm going to deal with that one on the next screen. Same thing with 407.5 and 4. Key repeat and the timed responses, and then the 411 audible signals. So that one is easy. You got to check. You got to make sure there's a visual indicator on the phone. But again, most models of desk phones will do that nowadays, so that you can mute your phone and still know that it's ringing because there's a light that flashes up. So that one's easy, usually. So continuing to slide 84. Volume gain, check. Most models will conform, and they're also going to drill down to 412.2.1, and they'll make that. 412.3, also, you need to check it, but it's going to conform. Digital encoding of speech, I mentioned that the 722.2 is now common, so not a problem. So we're left with just a couple things. The 412.5, the real-time text functionality. Again, it's reserved in the standards, but you certainly want to ask about it with your vendor or the person that's procuring the phone or is going to be installing the system. Most of these systems have some capacity for transmitting the real-time text at least. Ask about the roadmap. And 412.6 caller ID. This is a problem. So likewise with the tactically discernible, so I'm on slide 85. The key repeat and the timed response, I put these all together because this is all relating to that behavior of that screen and the soft buttons, the buttons that are custom configurable. Much of that display behavior is something that's under your control when you install the system, so you can configure and set it up so it meets these 508 requirements about 508 and about the time response and the key repeat. The thing that's going to be trickiest in that is making sure that the soft buttons, that they have a fixed behavior, so that if somebody cannot see the screen, they can still learn the behavior of the phone. So that reading the screen, is a convenience, but not essential and not an absolute requirement. I mentioned the real-time text. Ask your vendor about the roadmap. The caller ID one, probably that's going to require a third-party product. Again, these phones are typically hooked up to a computer, so being able to add software that makes the voice of the caller ID be spoken, if the phone doesn't do that directly, that's something that's reasonable to add as a third-party product to phone systems so that people who cannot see can still get the caller ID information. Very important. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tim.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Well, all right, we're in the home stretch. We're now on slide 56, and we're going to evaluate a smartphone with revised Section 508 provisions for hardware. Now, remember, we're only evaluating the hardware aspects of the phone. There are software aspects of these phones as well, which we are not addressing today. So what are the hardware key characteristics of a smartphone? Well, first of all, the touchscreen is the main or the only interface. You may have a few tactile discernible buttons, but that's more the exception than the rule. Secondly, they play video. And thirdly, they might support two-way video calling. Next slide, please. We're using the same analysis as Bruce did when we started talking about IP desk phones. We're going to look at smartphones. We're going to do a first pass. We've got all the provisions, 401 through 415, listed on this slide, and we're going to go very quickly through it. First, 401 general, doesn't apply in this case. 402 closed functionality, very important provision. We're going to come back to that. We've underlined it to remind ourselves this is an important thing to look at. Biometrics, okay, we'll deal with that shortly. 404, preservation of information, absolutely. 405, privacy, not really an issue. Because the single person uses the phone at a time. 406, standard connections. Okay. 407, operable parts, very important. 408, display screens, not applicable because this only applies to freestanding ICT. That's not the case here. 409, status indicators. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. 410, color coding. Similarly, 411, audible signals. We'll deal with those briefly. 412, ICT with two-way voice communication. So these are our big three, 402, 407, and 412. The remaining 413, closed caption processing, 414, audio description, and 415, user controls, we will deal with shortly. Okay, next slide. Again, we're approaching our triaging. We're using the easy stuff first. So here on slide 88, 403, biometrics. Remember we talked about biometrics could be allowed only as the sole means of identification, only if there was more than one format for biometrics. So if a lot of smartphones use fingerprints, if they also, you need to check and make sure if there's another way to identify the user of the phone besides fingerprint. So that's something you need to look at. 404, preservation of information provided for accessibility, that conforms. Most of them do. 406, standard connections, that conforms. You either have GACs or you have Bluetooth. 409, status indicators, you need to look and see, is the information provided in multiple formats? Similarly with 410, color coding. Unlike the desktop phones, which were basically light and dark, there's potential for a lot of different colors on a smartphone. So you need to make sure that that's provided. 411, audible signals, it does conform. It can vibrate as well as ring. So again, we've knocked off a lot of easy stuff here. Next slide, please. Okay, this is 89, evaluating smartphone for 402 closed functionality. Okay, speech output enabled. It has to be speech output enabled. So you have to make sure that you pick a model that has a built-in screen reading feature. So all iOS phones have this, and some Android phones have this. And remember, this has to be a display screen that should be speech output enabled for full and independent use by individuals with vision impairment. 402.2, closed functionality, remember, has 5 subsections, and none of them are really an issue in this case because the phones typically conform. In the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat all of them, but essentially this is covered in this instance. Next slide. Continuing with the rest of operable parts, evaluating smartphone, remember it's 407.2 and it goes through 407.8. So we're assuming that you have an accessible operating system here. So 407.2, the contrast, it would conform for most models. 407.3, input controls. This would be addressed by the exception. Remember, devices for personal use do not need to conform in this instance. 407.4, key repeats would conform. Remember, the assumption is this is a personal device, and also you have an accessible operating system. Similarly, with timed response, 407.5 conforms. 407.6, operation conforms. 407.7, tickets doesn't really conform because the phones do not dispense paper tickets. And 407.8, reach heightened up, does not apply because this is only for freestanding ICTs. Next slide, please. Here's a big one. Smartphone evaluated under two-way voice communication, 412. So 412.2.2, volume gains from non-wireline ICT. This does conform. Remember, these are hardware provisions we're talking about here. So mobile phones all have volume controls, so it does conform. Similarly, wireless handsets, many models conform. This has to do with the requirements for compatibility. Similarly, digital encoding of speech is not applicable in this case. Real-time text functionality is reserved, remember, so that is something that may become an issue in the future. 412.6 caller ID, most models conform. And the question of video communication, 412.7, that's something that you need to look at, and you need to figure out whether it does indeed work in your particular phone, and you often have to look at your operating system associated with real-time video functionality. So it applies where it provides that functionality. So, and then the question of whether or not you consider it sufficient to support sign language is a determination that you would need to consider. Okay, next slide, please. 92, evaluating a smartphone for closed captioning and audio description. 413, closed caption processing technologies. Again, this is hardware. These are the hardware provisions. So most models would conform. Similar with the audio description processing. Again, this is a hardware provision. So in the case of audio descriptions, they have speakers. They have sound output. So most models would conform in that regard. The question as to whether or not there is the supporting software is a different issue. We're only talking about the hardware requirements for the phone in today's presentation. Similarly, 415, user controls for captions and audio descriptions. This does conform because there is an exception in this provision for settings for devices for personal use. So that's the review we've done. And finally, last slide, 93. Revised standards for, we've just hit the few mop-up provisions for 2.2, speech output enabled. Selection models may be limited. You have to check out that the operating software provides access for status, color coding, and caller ID. And again, biometrics, if it is present, can you configure it to either make it be optional, or is there more than one biometric requirement? And then 412.3, like we said before, you will need to check to see whether it does indeed conform with the requirements for interference with hearing aids. And if it supports video calling, does it support video communications? So that is, you also have to look and see whether it supports captioning and audio description for 413, 414, and 415. And again, that's getting more into a software requirement, not so much in the hardware. So that concludes our discussion for today. I'm going to turn this over to Debbie, who is going to address our moderator questions. Debbie?
Thank you, Tim. Before we get to questions, let's go to the next slide, which is resources. Since this presentation, similar to others this year, is focusing on the 508 standards, the resources are all .gov resources. If you go to the Access Board website, www.access-board.gov, you'll find Section 508 standards, Section 255 guidelines, and technical assistance. There's the final rule, which was issued in 2017. You can also find links to the webinars this year, and be aware that more guidance material is actively under development and will be made available, and you'll know about it either from the Access Board website, so it's not a bad idea to go back there from time to time, and also you can find out about guidance material that should be issued soon at www.section508.gov. That's where GSA's government-wide Section 508 accessibility program is posting lots of information already about the new rules, and there are lots of different kinds of resources under development that will help people understand the technical standards, how to use them, as well as many of the programmatic and policy aspects of applying the new rules to 508 programs throughout government. So on to the next slide. We've got some time to take questions, and I will start with questions that have already come in. Just remember, you may type and submit questions in the chat area text box, and that's how we've already gotten some, or press Control-M, and you can enter text in the chat area that way. And let me start throwing them out to Bruce and Tim. So there was a question about printers, and are printers closed products?
So printers meet the definition of closed products or closed functionality in that you don't have to, in that you can't add assistive technology, or you can't add assistive technology to them. So I'm going to go back to slide 34 and look at the, slide 24, and bring us there, and repeat the general requirement for things with closed functionality. There's probably some clever way to do this without manually going back through each one, but I'm just going to go at the slow way and bring us all the way back to slide 24. So the general requirement is that ICT with the display screen shall be speech output enabled for full and independent by individuals with visual impairments. So one of the things that might happen there is that you might be able to use, there's also all these exceptions about things that are only using status indicators. So that might be the way that you provide the accessibility on the printer. The other thing is that the speech output you get from the system as a whole, if all the printer dialog boxes are accessible and compatible with screen reading technology, that is that they meet the software requirements, that's going to be a way to meet the standards directly as well. So that's a device for personal use, so there's some exceptions there if the printer's on your desk. So it's possible for printers to conform that way. If we're talking about a self-service copy machine, something that's more of a stand-up kind of thing, it is used in one place, it's used by multiple people, we are requiring copy machines to be speech output enabled.
What about multi-function devices that are networked to people's machines, to people's computers?
So sure, that's the more typical situation where it's, for all intents and purposes, it is stationary. So all of the retrained requirements would apply. We would pretty much treat it, I think we would treat it exactly like a copy machine from that regard. So you can either have the speech built into it directly, or that's not so common. You can also demonstrate that remember it's the functions for normal use that have to be accessible. So if somebody who's blind can go through all the normal things that you would do with a printer, a network printer, then you're conforming to the standards that way. Okay. So this isn't really a change from the status quo or what people's expectation is for printers and shared printers, or even copy machines, which are pretty much already required to be speech output enabled with the original 508 standards.
Okay. Thank you. Another question has to do with vending machines. And a questioner asked for a specific reference that vending machines would be covered as closed devices. The questioner is aware of kiosks and ATMs and things like that, but I think if I can read into the question, it would be useful for this person to have a specific reference to go to the person who says, what, they're covered by 508, and say, yes, they are, and here's how or why.
I do want to be clear that under ADA, vending machines are not required to be speech output enabled. And I kind of inferred that the person thought I had said that, and I was talking fast, so I hope I didn't say that. I did not mean to say that. Let me be clear about that. The ADA requirements require that ATMs and fair vending machines be speech output enabled. There's nothing in ADA about vending machines talking. There are some stuff about reach ranges and such, but I don't want to get into that. It's not my area of expertise. The person writing in the question, I think, knows more about it than I do, because they mentioned Section 309 of the ADA and such, so that's great. Now, in terms of vending machines being covered by 508, I'm not sure that I would say a vending machine is ICT. So go ahead, Tim.
Right, and what I would say, I would remind the viewer and all of our audience, remember, the first thing you always do with these rules, you don't jump and start digging into the technical requirements. First thing you always do is go to the application and scoping chapters. So first of all, this is ICT. Does it meet the definition of ICT as defined in Chapter 1 at B103.4? Transmit, maintain, manipulate, or use information. Like Bruce said, I think you would be hard-pressed to say whether a vending machine would meet that definition, so it would never be covered. Secondly, the question is, who's buying it? If it's a federal agency, it has to be procuring, using, maintaining, or developing the ICT. So those two requirements right there would preclude you from worrying about what does or doesn't apply, because 508 does not apply in that circumstance. As Bruce said, you could talk about ADA requirements, but that's not the subject of today's meeting.
Okay.
The important thing is for all of what we're talking about today, what Bruce and I are trying to do is not so much that you're going to remember every single detail of every single subprovision. We're trying to go over the approach that we're using under the revised standards, because it's always sequential. You start at Chapter 1 and work your way through.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is about number pads on keyboards and number pads on phones. And the questioner is noticing that there are two different requirements for the layout of the numbers. And I think the gist of the question is, why?
So the requirement for the alphabet keyboard is if you're providing an alphabetical layout, the layout needs to be in the QWERTY style arrangement so that somebody who's blind can still touch type on the system. So it's basically, the other things that sometimes will happen is people put displays keyboards in alphabetical arrangement, because if you don't touch type and you're not, that might be the easiest way for people to use generally. But if it's a keyboard, it needs to be in QWERTY for somebody who's blind to figure out where the keys are. And then there's also the question about the numeric keys. I'm on that was slide 48. I'm back there, brought up slide 49. The numeric keys are referring to a numeric keypad only, so the numeric keys you have on a QWERTY keyboard don't break either of these requirements. You can have them across the top, and you're not required to provide an alphabetical keyboard. You're not required to provide a numeric keypad, but when you do, the keypad needs to be arranged in the normal way. You can't only provide, say, 2 rows, 1 through 5 and 6 through 0. That would not conform with this requirement for 407.3.3 numeric keys.
Okay. So those are the questions that we've gotten so far, and we've still got a few minutes, and I'd like to invite any more questions that people might have, anything that either wasn't clear or specific situations that you may have dealt with that you'd like to hear Tim or Bruce talk about.
So this is Tim. I'm saying there's a question here where someone's asking, does this apply to county entities, or is this federal only? Okay, So this is a question we've answered a lot during the course of this year. And so first of all, the 508 standards, the law applies to federal agencies when they prepare, use, maintain, and develop ICT. The question coming up for county entities is because they are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Department of Justice has issued guidance saying that we understand that there are currently no technical requirements under the ADA for ICT or website accessibility. So state and local governments, as well as places of public accommodation, they're free to look at different ways of making content accessible, including the WCAG 2.0 standards or the Section 508 standards. So we realize that also some entities may be required to use the 508 technical provisions because of their funding requirements. For example, Medicaid, Medicare has entered into contractual relationships, we understand, with their vendors or service providers, and as a condition of receiving those funds, contractually they have agreed they shall provide and develop websites which are conform with the 508 standards. So the answer is it depends on what law applies to your particular entity and what your funding source requires of you. Section 508 on its face only applies to federal agencies, but the technical provisions may be used by others.
Okay. This is Deborah Kaplan again. So before we sign off, let me again reference you to some contact information. The U.S. Access Board can be reached by calling 800-872-2253, and the TTY number is 800-993-2822. You can email the Access Board at 508@access-board.gov. And again, the Access Board's website is www.access-board.gov. I'd like to thank everybody and especially thank our presenters for a great presentation going over a lot of detail fairly quickly. Thank you, Tim and Bruce. And thanks to the Great Lakes Center for making sure the webinar is smooth running and accessible. Thanks to all of you who attended, and we will see you again with another webinar about the revised standards in 2 months. Thank you.
We are seeing a lot of questions coming in at the last minute that we did not get to, so please do send those to Great Lakes or to us directly at 508@access-board.gov.
Thank you for attending today's webinar.